In this lecture, I'd like to describe basic soil properties and some of the ways that soil scientists, farmers, gardeners can analyze their soil to understand how it will perform better for the plants. The first soil characteristic that we will talk about is the soil profile. You already know a little bit about this. We've talked about this before. The O horizon is the top layer, the surface litter or fallen leaves, partially decomposed sticks and leaves and roots and bugs and things that are not fully decomposed. It could also be mulch that's on top, that's the O horizon. And underneath that is the topsoil, the part that contains the organic matter, most of the living organisms, bacteria, fungi, etc., most of the nutrients, most of the water, and most of the air. So it's the place where the plant roots really get what they need. It's the living layer of the soil for the most part. And in your lab exercises, you have measured the O horizon and sampled the A horizon, and also have taken dug down to see how deep the A horizon is. Sometimes you can get down to the B horizon, which is usually lighter in color because it has less moisture and less organic matter and less roots and things in it, and that is underneath the topsoil, or the A horizon. And underneath that is the C, partially weathered parent material, and then R horizon, the bedrock. Sometimes there's an E horizon, it's the zone of leaching. Things, as they leach down from the top to the bottom, can hit that top of the subsoil, the top of the B horizon, and slow down because of the different chemical properties and structure of the B horizon, so they don't keep leaching at the same rate and they kind of build up on top of that B horizon. So you've got the O, A, E, B, C, R. Mostly in this class, we're just going to be talking about the O and A horizon. Soil can be described in a number of ways. Mostly, as I said in the previous slide, we're talking about the topsoil here, the place where plants grow and their roots absorb water and nutrients and organic matter and organisms live, forming a soil food web. Mostly the soil consists of that texture, sand, silt, and clay, the different particle sizes of the minerals, and then water and air are parts of soil too. Both are important for, especially for soil microbial respiration and metabolism. They need water and air, and plants have to have water in the soil so that elements and nutrients get dissolved in the water, and then plants can absorb those nutrients in solution. Bacteria and fungi are in the soil, other microbes, larger organisms like worms, and then lots of good decomposed organic matter makes a nice rich topsoil. Soil texture is looking at only the mineral component, not the living component, not the microbes, not the water, the air, just the minerals, and breaking it down into three classes of sizes. The largest is the sand particles, the medium-sized particles are silt, and the smallest are clay. And it's not just sizes, it's their chemistry and functionality too that put them into these different categories. Clay particles are by far the tiniest. They are much, much tinier than silt or sand, and they have lots of surface area that can absorb and hold on to lots of nutrients and water and release them. On the right, you see a soil texture triangle, and when you do your soil texture test using the jar method, it's a quantitative method, you can look at the percentage of your soil that is sand, silt, and clay, and use this three-sided, three-axis graph to figure out the name or the type of soil texture that you have. You can see all those different types in those different colored polygons. As I said in the last slide, the texture indicates the ability of that soil to drain well or retain water, or a little bit of both. It tells you the amount of clay, which is the thing that retains water and nutrients too. But if it's all clay, it holds onto the water and nutrients too tightly, so you want a moderate amount of clay. In general, a good quality soil for most plants is a loam, or sandy loam, or silt loam, and that's about just approximately 40% sand, 40% silt, and 20% clay. As I said earlier, sand particles are the largest soil particles in the texture category, and silt particles are intermediate in size, clay particles are the smallest, with 1,000 to 1,000,000 times more surface area than silt or sand. Imagine emptied, cleaned out a jar, like a mayonnaise jar or something like that, and you put marbles in it. That would be analogous to the sand particles. You have big particles, lots of big air spaces in them. Water would drain through that really quickly. Next, you put gravel in there, much smaller than marbles, and you have a little more compaction. The open spaces in there aren't as big, and water would drain through it a little more slowly. Now what if you put flour into your jar? It'd be a lot more surface area, a lot more compact, and water would not drain through it very quickly. That's analogous to sand, silt, and clay. Clay particles are little teeny flaky pieces like flour compared to big, chunky, hard pieces like marbles, analogous to sand. Humus is the decomposed organic matter in the soil, and it's actually a very complex substance. It's dark and rich and kind of gooey, and it is full of lots of different types of molecules, some not all identified. But humus and clay particles have negative charges on the outside of them, of those compounds, and they attract positively charged plant nutrients like calcium or magnesium, potassium, things like that. They can get stuck to the clay particle, and if there's just some clay particles and there's not too many, then the clay particle also releases those to the soil, water, and then to the plant. So you kind of want some of those around. The clay particles are good for that reason. So besides soil texture, we have other things like just the components, what this soil is comprised of. It's got air, water, minerals, and organic matter. Within organic matter, you have living organic matter, organisms, microbes, and roots of plants that are alive. And then the humus part, and the humus is also comprised of things like dead animals, dead roots, and all those things that haven't decomposed but are not part of a living organism anymore. And another slide organizing the different micro and macronutrients into different categories. So we've got macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, sulfur, magnesium. And most fertilizers are focused on nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those ones are kind of the biggies for plant growth and production. Micronutrients, iron, manganese, copper, zinc, nickel, molybdenum, boron, chlorine. And then some other nutrients that are sometimes included in these lists are sodium, silicon, cobalt, selenium, and aluminum. Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are also plant nutrients, but the plants get those on their own from the air. And we don't think about those as much as humans, or don't focus on that because we don't have to give them to the plant in the form of fertilizer or healthy compost or soil. The plant is able to obtain the carbon and oxygen on its own from the atmosphere, and the hydrogen and oxygen from the soil water. Let me describe another soil property called cation exchange capacity. This is always a little bit of a tricky concept to get. It's just the ability of a soil to hold on to and release plant nutrients to the soil water and thus to the plant. So the higher its cation exchange capacity, usually the more fertile the soil is. A cation is a charged molecule, and if it has a positive charge, it's called a cation. And I remember that because when you look at that word cation, it has that little T in it, like a plus. So like I said in a previous slide, we've got potassium, magnesium, calcium. They're all positively charged ions in the soil, and the soil can hold on to those if you've got a nice moderate amount of clay particles. And then when some water comes in, the clay particles get bumped off. The cations like magnesium or calcium will get bumped off of the clay particle by a hydrogen ion, and then that nutrient ion, that cation, goes into solution in water and can become absorbed by a plant. So it's really the ability of a plant to get what it needs from the soil, or the ability of the soil to give the nutrients to the plant. The higher the CEC, usually the higher the clay content to a point until you have too much clay. So CEC is a measure of soil fertility. This slide shows you a comparison of the cation exchange capacity of a clay soil and a sandy soil. On the left, you have a heavy or high clay content soil. It has lots of clay particles, which have lots of negative charges, which can attract all of those positive cation nutrients seen in the middle between those two blocks: calcium, magnesium, ammonium, sodium, potassium. So you've got lots of ability of that soil to hold on to those and then release them to the plant. And on the right, you've got a soil with high sand content, which does not have nearly as much clay and nearly as many negative charges on the particles in itself, so it can't hold on to as many plant nutrients, thus it can't release them. So a soil has to be able to hold on to the nutrients for a while for plant roots to grow and get to them. If it's really sandy, it can't hold on to too much, and they get washed away, so those nutrients don't stick around and the plant doesn't get to absorb them. So the plant's ability the soil's ability to hold on to nutrients for a while, which is directly related to how much clay it has, is its ability to give plants what they need. Soil porosity is another property of soil, and it's the flip side of the bulk density. So bulk density measures the amount of solid material in a given volume. Soil porosity measures the amount of open space in that same given volume. So it's the amount of open pores and air. And the porosity is important because plant growth is greatly affected by things like moisture availability, fertility, aeration, heat transfer, and bulk density. Some basic soil structure terms. A granular soil is lots of small roundish particles, kind of fine and loose, blocky or a little bit bigger chunks. Some are angular, some not. Lenticular are like lenses, lots of thin little layered pieces. Those are the smallest particles. Platy, flat, also layered. Wedge, prismatic, columnar. These are looking at the smallest soil particles and how they aggregate together and what forms they take. And that tells you about the soil's ability to perform and support plants as well. pH. Soil pH is a really important property regarding plant growth. What is pH? pH is the hydrogen ion concentration in the soil. Hydrogen ion is a cation, has a positive charge, and it's the thing that's in the soil and in the soil water that will bump off the nutrients off of the clay and make them available to plants. So it's important. It relates to the activity of that hydrogen ion with other compounds, like the nutrient ions. Technically, it's the negative log of the hydrogen ion concentration, approximately. So why do we care so much about pH? Because if there's too much, the pH is too high, meaning the pH number is high, you have a very alkaline soil, more kind of basic and salty in general. And if you have too low of pH, it's very acidic. And at either extreme, plant nutrient ions become unavailable to the plant. They get locked up in the chemistry of the soil and not released to the plant. So if you have really low pH, there's lots of hydrogen ions, you have a very acidic soil, and it means more nutrient cations are released from the soil particles, but then they get released too quickly and often are not available to plants. Too many of them will make the nutrient cations get washed away. They're not held onto for any good period of time. A really high pH is a basic or alkaline soil. There's very few hydrogen ions, and there's not enough for the nutrient cations to get bumped off of the clay by the hydrogen ion. So again, you have low availability of plant nutrients. So somewhere in the middle, right around 5 to 7 pH number, is what's the best for plant growth and nutrient availability. By the way, the scale of pH is from 0 to 14, so 7 is right in the middle. Here's a little image to give you a better idea of pH. The maximum cation exchange is right between around pH 7 to 7.5 Here it says 6.9 to 7.3. But that's when you're going to get the most plant nutrient cations available for the plant. They're held onto by the soil, but they're released readily as well. If you go too high of pH, it goes blue or alkaline, and you have not enough hydrogen ions to bump off those cations and make them available. Too much, you got too low of pH, it's acidic. You have too many hydrogen ions, and they're bumping those nutrients off so fast that the nutrients get washed away and there's less available to the plant. This image is a way to depict the availability of nutrients according to pH. Look at the very bottom of that image. You've got pH 4 on the bottom left and pH 10 on the bottom right. So really, like I said, pH goes from 0 to 14. This is just showing the central portion of that, because this is where plant nutrients are available or not. And they're listed here. You've got the top 6 macronutrients right on top, and you can see the thickness of that kind of spear, that green wedgy thing. The thickness of that is showing you its availability. So right at pH 7, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, magnesium are all pretty much at their maximum availability. You can see as nitrogen, as the soil gets too basic to the right or too acidic to the left, the availability of nitrogen goes down. Those little wedges get thinner and thinner. And that's true for calcium and magnesium too. And it varies according to the nutrient and the micronutrients, but in general, right there in the middle, most nutrients are available. And definitely the macronutrients on top are very available.